This war is happening in the Middle East. But the biggest impact might not stay there. Thousands of kilometers away in Europe, the effects are already being felt. Fuel prices are rising, economies are under pressure, and a new crisis may be building. The question is, why will Europe suffer the most from the Iran-Israel conflict? To understand this, we first need to look at what exactly happened. The conflict escalated when Israel carried out strikes targeting critical Iranian infrastructure, including key energy facilities. In response, Iran retaliated with attacks across the Gulf region, targeting oil and gas installations. This was not just a military exchange. It directly hit one of the most important energy-producing regions in the world. And that's where the real problem begins, because when energy infrastructure is attacked in the Middle East, it doesn't just affect the countries involved, it shakes the entire global supply system. And Europe is one of the most vulnerable parts of that system. The biggest reason Europe will suffer the most is simple: energy dependency. Unlike countries like the United States, Europe does not produce enough oil and gas to meet its own needs. It relies heavily on imports from external regions, including the Middle East. So when conflict disrupts supply in that region, Europe immediately feels the impact. As tensions rise, energy markets react instantly. Prices begin to spike, supply chains become uncertain, and governments start preparing for shortages. Even small disruptions can create panic in the market. And this war is far from small. This means higher fuel prices, more expensive electricity, and rising costs for industries across Europe. Factories that depend on energy now have to pay more to operate. And when production costs increase, those costs are passed on to consumers. But the situation becomes even more dangerous when we look at one critical location: the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most important oil routes in the world. Nearly 20% of global oil supply passes through it every single day, and Iran has significant control and influence over this region. If tensions escalate further and this route is disrupted or blocked, the consequences could be massive. Oil supply to global markets would shrink overnight, prices would surge dramatically, and once again Europe would be among the hardest hit, because Europe depends on these routes to keep its energy flowing. Now combine this with Europe's current economic condition. Europe is already dealing with slow economic growth and inflation challenges. Many countries are still recovering from previous energy crises and global disruptions. Their economies are not in a strong position to absorb another major shock. So when energy prices rise again, it creates a dangerous situation. Inflation increases, growth slows down, and the risk of recession becomes very real. This is what economists call a double pressure scenario, where everything becomes more expensive, but economic growth does not keep up. And this pressure doesn't stay limited to governments or big industries. It directly affects everyday people, because when energy prices go up, everything else follows. Transportation becomes more expensive. Airlines face higher fuel costs, which means ticket prices rise. Shipping costs increase, which leads to higher prices for goods and food. Electricity bills go up, putting pressure on household budgets. So even if someone is far away from the war zone, they still feel its impact in their daily life. A simple trip becomes more expensive. Groceries cost more. Heating and electricity bills rise. This is how a distant war turns into a personal financial burden. Now let's compare this with the United States. The US is far more energy independent. It produces a large portion of its own oil and gas domestically. So while global prices may still affect it, the overall impact is much less severe. Europe, on the other hand, is deeply exposed to external supply shocks. This creates an imbalance. The same war affects both regions, but not equally. While the United States has a level of protection due to its domestic production, Europe remains vulnerable because it depends on imports. And this vulnerability is exactly why Europe stands to suffer the most. There is also a longer-term risk. If this conflict continues or expands, companies may start reconsidering their operations in Europe. High energy costs make it less competitive compared to other regions. Industries could shift production elsewhere, leading to job losses and slower economic growth. This creates a ripple effect across the entire economy. Less production leads to fewer jobs. Fewer jobs reduce spending, and reduced spending slows down economic recovery even further. So what starts as a conflict in one region gradually turns into a global economic issue, with Europe at the center of the impact. And the most important thing to understand is this: Europe is not directly part of this war, but it is deeply connected to its consequences. Because in today's world, energy, economy, and geopolitics are all interconnected. A disruption in one region can trigger a chain reaction across continents. And right now, that chain reaction is already in motion. If the conflict continues, or if it escalates further, Europe could face another major energy crisis, possibly even worse than before. And that brings us to the biggest question: how long can Europe handle this pressure? Because if energy prices continue to rise, if supply remains uncertain, and if economic conditions worsen, then this war could leave a lasting impact far beyond the battlefield. Not just in the Middle East, but in the homes, economies, and daily lives of millions of people across Europe. And that is why, out of all regions affected by this conflict, Europe might end up paying the highest price.